All right, so a bit of a different layout for today's video. And today I am going to talk about victim blaming because just recently I contributed to an article with the Courier Mail or a newspaper in Oz. And what came with it, the article was supposed to be about how do we as men show up to prevent domestic and family violence? How do we show up for the men around us to prevent them from taking these steps? How do we support people in these relationships? What can we do? And what came off the back of it was a whole bunch of people blaming my friend Hannah for what happened to her. Now, for those who don't know, you can go to my Instagram and look at one of my pinned videos and see really who Hannah Clark was and who she was to me and what happened. And, when they passed away, I started doing this work, started traveling around and having conversations with people about how to prevent domestic violence, how to prevent murder in the context of domestic violence. And look, I've told this story a few times. I've told what happened to Hannah, and then a couple of occasions, one in particular, when I was talking to a group of people who worked in road construction, I said to them, what happened to Han? And then someone in the room stood up and said, well, she probably brought it on her fucking self. Just like a lot of the people in the comments that we saw on this newspaper article. And look, it would have been well within my rights for me to stand there. I think a lot of people would have felt that I was justified if I did say, shut the fuck up and get out, right? People would have said, that's fine, Dave, you can do that because that's a horrible thing for him to say about your best friend. But I didn't do that. And the reason for that is because I think a lot of people are trying to make sense of these really horrible things that happen. And to make sense of that, they think in their mind they have to come up with some kind of rational or logical path towards why someone would do something so horrible. And that takes them to blaming her. Now, there's a whole culture around this that also exists, and I recommend you read Fixed It by Jane Gilmore because that talks way more to the culture and the media and how women especially are blamed in the media for the things that men do to them. But coming back to this comment that was made in this workshop, so acknowledging that this bloke was about 60 years old, he'd been working in construction for his entire life, probably 40 years. So he'd probably spent a lot of time around a lot of other men. And the culture around domestic violence would largely have been silent for a long time for this guy, or at least hidden in the silence. And so now that there's all these conversations happening about it, he's jumping to all these short conclusions that he's come up with that have been fed by media, the TV shows he's watched, the guys he's hung out with on sites, and all the kind of victim blaming statements that happen within his workplace. And for me, in that moment, it was about trying to think to myself, this bloke has not lived the life I've lived. He doesn't know what I know. So instead of saying, oh, yeah, quit, get out, I said, mate, look, I get it. It's hard to try and understand these really horrific things that happen. And sometimes we try to look for some way to explain it to ourselves. The problem is when we explain it to ourselves by blaming her for his actions, for him taking her life and the life of those children, we never actually address the problem. We never actually address the fact that this man felt entitled to take the life of his ex-partner and their 3 children. What got him to that point in his own journey? Because it wasn't her. It's never her. So we have to always come back to what was going on in his life and what steps did he take. Now, one of the challenges we have is that when men use violence, especially, the media will often try to blame something else rather than him and his behavior. They will often, look, the reality is if they can't blame his race, his religion, his class, then they'll blame her. Now, I did offer a short version on my Instagram when I posted about this video regarding a scenario when blame is placed in different places depending on who the act is perpetrated against. Go feel free to watch that one. But I want to talk about one of the other things we blame. We tend to blame, if we can't blame where he's from or his religion or his class, or we can't blame her, then we'll look to drugs and alcohol or some kind of addiction that could have made him do this thing. And it's really weird because we will say, how much was he drinking in a way, in an attempt to try and excuse the behavior that he chose to do. We'll ask, how much was he drinking to excuse him? But whenever a woman has been sexually assaulted and has also been drinking alcohol, people will say, well, how much was she drinking? Because, when women drink, they. So we use alcohol as a way to blame her for what he did to her but will use alcohol as a way to excuse him for what he did to her. You see how it's all kind of messed up, and it's always kind of consistently blaming the victim of the problem? It's never actually, in fact, it's not just always blaming her. The main goal of it, the main goal of victim blaming is to ensure we never, ever, ever hold the perpetrator accountable. Is that we constantly deflect accountability away from what he did and instead blame race, culture, religion, class, her, drugs, alcohol, anything else apart from him and the behaviors he chose. And what this actually does is it prevents us from being able to see an opportunity to be able to show up, to stop him from doing whatever it is he thinks he's entitled to doing. Now, I just want to come back to one of those victim blaming statements. And it says, she knew her husband better than anyone. She should have ended that in any other male friendship. I can guarantee she would have been accused of daily of cheating. Now, first and foremost, Eva, I hope you're okay. That is a really concerning comment for someone to make. Secondly, I think there's this weird kind of concept that people can't be friends. You can't have a friendship with someone who may be of the sex or gender that you're attracted to. That's weird. The fact that we sexualize every person of the gender we might be attracted to, whether we rate them high or low or whatever, like that's weird that we have to do that, because we don't. But the other thing it reminds me of is a conversation I had with a group of students, and we were talking about kind of the expectations that are placed on women and girls. And one of them was talking about, certain clothes they should wear. And he was saying, they can be revealing, but they shouldn't be too revealing, especially if they're your girlfriend, because, they can get attention, but you don't want them getting too much attention. And I was like, so who gets to decide what that looks like? Getting attention, but not too much attention. And then he kind of said, well, she should know. And also, if I tell her that that's not okay, then she shouldn't do it. And then that erupted in a big conversation in the room. Some people were yelling, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. And some people were yelling, yeah, you should, that's fair. And I had to calm the room and just say, look, team, I get it. I can understand why someone would be really upset about someone else deciding for them what they should wear. I can also understand that for someone who may be 15 or 16 years old, for the first time in their life, feeling jealous in the context of a relationship is saying, hey, maybe don't do that thing. I can understand because they're young, man, and they're going through this stuff for the first time. Like a few years ago, they were just jealous that their sibling got the bigger piece of birthday cake. Now they're jealous that the person they're interested in or dating is getting attention from other people. That's a huge change of context, and that becomes really difficult to deal with. And we can't expect people to just have the skills to deal with that straight away. When I talked about it in this particular way, and obviously I unpacked it a lot further than that, what it did was it opened a bit of a doorway for this lad who came up to me after the session. He said, man, I just want to continue that conversation we were having earlier about, telling her what to wear and stuff, because I kind of felt like I wasn't doing anything wrong, but I could hear that maybe I wasn't making her feel good, or I was making her feel unsafe, and I don't want to do that. So what's the deal? And we got into a bit of a chat, and by the end of the chat, or somewhere towards the middle really, he said, it kind of always just comes back to me feeling like I'm not enough. And then we reflected on some of the content that he consumes online, and we started to really unpack this world that he's living in, where he's constantly being told he's not enough from these online toxic influencers who tell them that you've got to max out on everything, looks max, money max, status max, max, everything. And then you're just constantly feeling like you're just not doing enough. And then there's someone else who might be looks maxing better, or money maxing better, or status maxing better, and all of a sudden she's going to want to be with that dude. And so you think that you can tell her what to wear or what to do so that you can feel better. And ultimately, this lad didn't want to do that. He wanted her to feel safe. And this is a point, right? So many people just want to jump down a young lad's throat for saying she shouldn't be wearing that, or making a misogynistic or a sexist comment. And I can understand the anger and the frustration for some people who've been impacted by that throughout their lives. But all I'll say is, for like a 15 or 16-year-old lad who's saying this sort of stuff, he's probably just repeating the scripts that he's learned through these online channels where there's these toxic morons, but there's also like a feeling underneath it. And if we give him space to talk about the feeling, then we get to the point where he starts to say, okay, so this is what I'm actually going through. I don't feel like I'm good enough. And then we actually can work towards some kind of solution for this lad or for the lads around him. Like, we have to open the space for that conversations, because when they reflect like that and they say, I don't feel like I'm good enough, what we get back to is that underlying fear that is driving those behaviors. Like, I'm afraid that I'm going to lose her. I'm afraid that I'm not good enough, whatever it is. And when we work through that, we can build a sense of security in ourselves and know that as long as we show up as the best person we can be in our relationships, then everything will be okay. But anyway, we went down a bit of a path here away from the victim blaming kind of stuff that we started with. But I think it's in the same place, right? We sit there and we might yell at a young lad and blame him for what he's for what he's saying to his girlfriend. I think if we just get curious about this dude and have that conversation with him, just like I did with that guy at the workshop who told me she probably brought it on herself. When I got curious about him and I asked him to stay with us in that room, he sat through a 4-hour workshop on the prevention of gender-based violence and the prevention of men's suicide. And I think that really helped him. So when we build these conversations around curiosity and around empathy, I think we get a lot further with this stuff. So let's try not to argue over the fence and support each other to take healthy steps.